So thank you all for being here. I'm very pleased that joining us is Dr. Rob Sauders from Eastern Washington University, who will talk with us and to us about the film Incitement through the lens of his scholarship in Middle East studies. I'll just give you the 5-cent tour here. Rob's teaching has focused on the Middle East, Islam, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, transnational activism, and peacebuilding, among other topics. And his research includes an emphasis on non-state actors who engage in political discourse from grassroots social justice frameworks that cut across traditional ethnic, national, and religious boundaries. He received his Ph.D. in Anthropology from American University in 2007 and currently serves as Vice President for Student Affairs at Eastern Washington University. So welcome, Rob. And I will turn it over to you to make a few introductory comments.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. When Neil asked me, I told him, I said, hey, this is great. You know, I haven't been able to be in a classroom for a while, and this is the closest thing I've had to being in a classroom, getting to talk about ideas and engage in dialogue like this. So I was really happy to do it. Watched the film the other night, and yeah, that was a powerful film. Brought up a lot of different sort of emotions and feelings, and different thoughts about, you know, where we were at that period of time, where we've gone in the intervening, you know, what has it been, 25 years or so. It gives you a lot to chew on. It's a thought-provoking film. As Neil kind of alluded to, this is a part of the world where I've spent a fair amount of my research time. I started off doing archaeology in Jordan, and then started working in the sort of cultural politics of Israel and Palestine, and did that for a little while, and then moved into sort of, as Neil mentioned, looking at issues of cooperative peace building. Sort of had an academic version of a midlife crisis as I was completing my dissertation, kind of saying, you know, I think this kind of cultural heritage work is important, and particularly in an area that's so rich with it, like, and where it's so heavily contested, like Israel and Palestine. But at the same time, spending, you know, a lot of time over there, it almost seemed like a luxury to be engaged in that kind of research, whereas there was this underlying dynamic and need for conversations about how does this situation actually move towards a more peaceful resolution. And so coming from that, I mean, we'll kind of get into it at another point. Well, actually, we'll just talk about it now. One of the groups that I worked with when I started really looking in at cooperative peace building was a group called the Combatants for Peace, which when I was running around with them, and oh gosh, Diana will correct me if I'm wrong, but if memory serves me correct, it was like 2008, 2009. They were a relatively new organization. And it was interesting. They were, for those of you who don't know who the Combatants for Peace are, when they were founded, they were these relatively small groups of Israelis and Palestinians, and they structured their units in the sense that you had to have equal numbers of Israelis and equal number of Palestinians within your cells. And so you would have groups of 4 or 5 Israelis, 4 or 5 Palestinians. All the Israelis had been former IDF soldiers. All the Palestinians had been engaged in some form of militancy during their lifetime, and they came together, as I always kind of explain to my students rather glibly but somewhat accurately. They kind of came together and said, here's a novel concept. Maybe we should stop trying to kill each other and actually build a peaceful society. And they really tried to leverage that positionality that they had within each of their societies as being people who had either sacrificed or committed themselves or had done their service, right? That gives them a certain amount of cred within their society, right? And so they were trying to parlay that into sort of forcing these really difficult conversations. And it was really, really interesting work, because at this point in time, you know, I meet some of the Israeli guys down in Jerusalem, and then we would drive, and we'd have to park the car and go for a hike, because if the Israelis got caught going into Area A, which is where their Palestinian colleagues were to have these meetings, they were getting fined like the equivalent of $5,000, and most of them were working sort of like blue collar jobs. And I remember distinctly driving over one time with a guy, and I just said to him, I'm like, well, what are you gonna do? And he goes, you mean if I get caught and I have a $5,000 fine? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, my wife's going to kill me, so I'm not sure I'm going to really have to do anything. So it was a really interesting time to be looking at that. And I'll kind of circle back to, I told Neil when we talked about this earlier today, I'm probably going to say some things at the end that kind of seem like a bummer, in the sense that I'm not sure where the hope is. But I think when we circle back, we can look at that set of interactions all the way back, and starting in 2008, 2009, going forward from there, that there is some hope out there, that there is a way to cobble together peace in all of this. So I'll just make a couple real brief comments and then really try and stop talking, because as I always tell folks that I work with who aren't on the faculty side, when you're faculty, you speak in 50-minute increments and you do not come up for air. And I'm trying to, reform myself off of that to the best extent that I can. So I kind of came up with like 4 points that I wanted to sort of mention.
Jeff, it's worth hearing.
Well, hopefully. But 4 points of things that I thought of when I watched this. So one was this notion of the existential threat of change, right? And I think when you look through that movie, and you see how different individuals and different institutions are responding to this prospect of a peace settlement between Israelis and Palestinians, you see a real fear, a visceral fear over what is the change that will be made from that going to do to the societies that they live in. And one of the things to always keep in mind is that, this is me as the anthropologist sort of speaking, but societies, by their very nature are, and this is not a political designation, it's what I call small c conservative, in that they don't welcome change quickly or easily. Societies by their very nature are sort of pre-programmed and designed to sort of resist massive amounts of change happening very quickly. And when they do, when we do see historically change happening very quickly within societies, you just see one of two things happening. Either there's a reactionary backlash, right, where the more conservative movements then come forward and sort of pull back power and control, and they try and regain ground and reassert their sort of dominance within society, or there's high level violence. Those are usually the two sort of pathways that you see. And I think when you look in the film and you see you have, Amir, you have the rabbis he talks to, the politicians he listens to, they're all perceiving themselves as not only vulnerable, but in many ways as being victims of this change that's sort of lurking out there, with the prospects of this, what would be a very radical reconstruction of the political landscape within the region by having a peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. And the only way in their minds, what you're seeing is, the only way to stop that victimization is through the utilization of violence, and in particular political violence, which then kind of leads to the second point that I was thinking about, which is, the movie really demonstrates what is the cyclical nature of violence. There's this sort of axiom that exists that violence begets violence, right? And there's a whole raft of literature on that. You can go into different literatures in terms of, psychology and social work and all these things where, it's, if a child is abused, they're more likely to be predisposed to abusing their children, and so on and so forth. And you kind of see it when in the film, they started off with a conversation around Baruch Goldstein and the massacre in Hebron, where it's interesting. Amir really justifies Goldstein's attack in that mosque. And when others condemn this violence, he justifies it by basically citing that earlier iteration of violence that happened in the 1920s in Hebron. And then to sort of move it forward, when the Palestinians began responding to that cycle of violence by conducting attacks within Israeli civil installations, then what you have is you have Amir using that as a justification to launch out his own planning of attacks within Palestinian civil areas. And so what you do is you start having this cycling up of violence that eventually, as Amir is unable to sort of complete that, it then shifts very quickly over to, well, we will then shift it over towards, targeting Ravine within that cycle of violence. And so in the peace and violence and culture research that I've done, one of the things that you really look at is that extracting individuals and communities from this cycle of violence requires both, for lack of better terms, a strength of character and an understanding that is very difficult to find during widespread intercommunal violence, because everybody's so focused on that visceral moment of, this happened to me, and so the response must be, and that's what perpetuates those cycles. And I think one of the things that breaks it is there needs to be a maturity and a strength, a maturity and a strength that needs to occur within societies that say we can break out of this. And there's different ways in which that has happened. Usually there's some rooting in an understanding surrounding religion and a religious call towards breaking that silence. Not breaking that silence, totally different conversation, totally different day, but breaking that cycle. And sometimes it's rooted in economic means, sometimes it's rooted in more political means, but usually we can go back and find some sort of religious mechanism that allows that to sort of break. And what was interesting in the film to me was we were seeing a lot of utilization of religion to continue that cycle of violence. And for every one of those ways in which religion was utilized to cycle up the violence, it's very easy to go back through and demonstrate alternative ways that religion can also be used to de-escalate that violent cycle. So that's one other thing that kind of came to my mind. Other point was there was a sort of irresponsibility among institutions throughout the film. This is me as a political anthropologist. It's kind of like the sixth sense where, instead of seeing dead people everywhere, I see power everywhere, or I see power, structured within institutions. And that's usually kind of how I start trying to make sense of the phenomena that I look at. But in regards to that, I think you saw, whether we're talking about the politicians, to a certain extent, the university, to a certain extent, the military, and certainly amongst the rabbinate, we see moments where these institutions sort of facilitate Amir and fuel his desire to sort of engage in this conceptualization and cycling of violence that he sort of leads to. The part that I found really difficult to watch, given sort of the current moment that we are in, is a lot of the sort of winking and nods that were done as they spoke with Amir. The sort of carefully crafted words that made it very clear what was being communicated, but also provided the sort of plausible deniability so that one could metaphorically wash one's hands of the situation should it actually sort of spiral out of control. And there's probably some contemporary examples that we could draw from that. In that vein, I think that the sort of irresponsibility that you were seeing in there are these sort of, in the moment you look at it and you say, there's such horrifying acts, it leads to such horrifying violence. But then if we think about what happened from 1995 and moving forward, as you kind of see in the end credits of the film, it only took a few months for this to really sort of dull within everybody's senses. And we got to a point where, Shimon Peres is no longer the prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu comes in, and then just kind of look what happened to the peace process from that point forward. I mean, yeah, we can talk about maybe during Olmert's period in office, maybe during Ehud Barak's period in government, maybe there was some thought that we could re-spark the peace process, but in reality, the peace process really had a fatal wound. Not to be too cliche about it, but the peace process really took a fatal wound with the assassination of Rabin, which then sort of led to decades of this sort of continued cycle of violence that we're seeing within Israel and Palestine. Even if today it's relatively muted, it's still there sort of under the surface, which then, as I kind of alluded to earlier, leads to the, where I told Neil I was afraid I was going to end on a bummer, which is, this sort of question of, was Yigal Amir successful in what he wanted to accomplish? And I think we have to ask the question of, well, what is it that he wanted? And I mean, I think that's a very complex question. Don't get me wrong, because clearly there was a lot there. But at the end of it, I think what it was a desire to destroy the peace process, right? And after 25 years, with the 25 years after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, I mean, what do you have? You have Benjamin Netanyahu as the longest serving prime minister in the history of Israel. Both the two-state solution and a comprehensive peace process, which those two are actually somewhat separate things, but a comprehensive peace solution for Israelis and Palestinians is effectively non-existent. It's not to say that it isn't a possibility for a future peace, but at this point in time, the peace process is effectively dead. And there's few partners for peace on either side of the equation. And you got to kind of sit there and ask yourself, if Amir wanted to derail and prevent a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was he successful? And the answer is probably yes. But then, as I sort of promised to Neil, and this will be the last point, and then I'll be more quiet. So where's the hope, right? You kind of go through all that and you're like, well, that's really, pretty dark to sit there and say, well, one assassination by one man then destroys an entire peace process. So where do you derive hope from that? And I think that the hope is this, and it's that whether we're looking at cultures or communities or people, they don't remain static, right? Our understandings evolve, our willingness to grow and adapt, they develop, and our ability to make hard sacrifices, difficult concessions, and painful decisions that can lead to peaceful resolution do in fact develop, even when we think that they can't, right? And the thing that always I sort of draw students back to when we have these very difficult conversations in class surrounding issues of peace and violence and culture is this sort of very bedrock principle, and that is that every single culture captured within it has the necessary components for peace and coexistence, right? We know, I mean, there's not a single community out there that lacks that ability. It's just the pathways sometimes are incredibly difficult. Sometimes the openings are incredibly narrow, but they do exist. And so one of the things that I'll kind of leave you with, and I'll stop, is that just keeping in mind that even when it seems bleak, we have within ourselves that ability to make things better, to move towards peace, if and when we so choose to. So that's kind of the thoughts I had on the film. And I'm really sort of laid back in the way in which I run classes and stuff. So it's kind of a free for all at this point for any questions, comments, or thoughts people might have.
And feel free to unmute yourselves. We're a small enough group. I think that will be just fine. So anyone who would like to join in.
This is Chris. There we go. Actually, I don't know if we're visible there. That's Southern California, by the way, Josh. Oh, I guess it's not. It's a bunch of beehives. Okay, never mind. What's the significance of Amir coming from Yemen?
So, I mean, I think that opens up a whole other sort of area that you can explore, which is the sort of relationship and dynamics and the politics and the social structuring between, you know, the Mizrahi community and the Ashkenazi community within Israel. It is, I mean, it's really complicated, which is always like the sort of professorial way of saying I'm not sure exactly what I want to say here. But with that being said, it's probably as close as we can understand to the best way that we can understand it in this society is it's a sort of mixture of both class and race. And that's kind of how it manifests itself within Israel. I think you saw that really clearly when there was this sort of comment about, was the woman's name Nada? Did I have that correct?
Nava.
The woman that he was seeking to ask for marriage, and that whole conversation of like when mom was sitting there saying it's all good until she introduces you to mom and dad, and then this isn't going to work because you're Mizrahim. The best way to sort of understand that, like I said, is a mixture of both class and race.
Yeah,
it's not racial.
Can I add something? I think it's a great answer, and I think it's a fascinating question. And I was actually surprised, and I'd be interested to dig deeper, even into the way that this movie was reviewed and covered, particularly within the Hebrew-speaking and Israeli space, because the emphasis on this subplot of this young man of Yemenite Jewish background seeking to realize himself as a bona fide Jewish nationalist in the mold of the dominant white Ashkenazi national religious movement within the country was clearly a priority for this director, because he threads it through. You know, it's not subtle. There's the story, there's the romantic story, obviously. We notice that the vast majority of those who he's passing in these various moments at the retreats in Jericho, out on the hilltops, are don't have the same skin color as he does. I mean, it's really prominent. And I wonder whether that is one place where the directors actually may have kind of taken a little bit more interpretive license. I don't know how much I don't know enough about the Yigal Amir story. I know a little bit, but I wonder whether that is where they kind of stretched a bit in their own interpretation of the significance of this piece of Yigal Amir's, self-understanding and identity. But I think it's totally fascinating as like a subplot here, and it's really interesting question.
Yeah, I also don't know about the accuracy of, that whole, like you said, that subplot, but I think that if it's not true as a device for storytelling with a movie that's called Incitement, which is a movie that we know, within the first 5 minutes how this is, we all know how it's ending, but we still are on this slow moving, train. That it works really well as a device for storytelling because it further creates him as an other in every aspect of his life. And that is part of how he becomes so radicalized. One of the most interesting relationships to me in the movie, and again, we don't know I don't know the accuracy, is his relationship with his father. And this person where, is presented basically as maybe the one person who could pull him back from this ledge. But obviously that's not how it works out. But it's hard to have a character like that in the movie because of course you know what's going to happen, but you're still like, yeah, Dad, get to him. But no, you know.
Well, I think you raise a really good point about the whole way in which Amir's identity, right, and how he constructs his identity is sort of woven throughout the entire film. I mean, Aaron, to your point, I'm not sure I saw another character that I could have sort of on face value been like, oh yeah, that's another Mizrahim.
Oh,
I'm not sure. I mean, aside from
few.
that, right? You know, Dad was pretty clear, but other than that, I mean, it got kind of dicey in terms of saying that there were others, and it probably is an inaccurate reflection. But I don't know that for sure. It just, you know, the laws of probability tell me that it's probably inaccurate. But yeah, I mean, the whole way in which there's a lot of identity crisis going on with Amir throughout the film, right? Like he's never really fully formed, right? You know, what are you studying? Well, law and maybe computers. I don't know. Okay, so that, you know, look at the relationship piece. You know, we kind of bounce around a little bit in there, trying to sort of sort that piece out. Then the whole Mizrahim Ashkenazim thing, that, you know, that's another dimension to it. And it's the identity is not well. The individual's identity is not well formed throughout this.
I did a little bit of digging about the way that it was received, and there were some critics when it first came out in Israel who actually felt that this film, in as much as the directors, I think, meant for it to be a very serious, you know, reckoning and self-reflection for Israelis about what this moment has wrought now for, you know, 25 years on, and the current status of relations in Israel-Palestine. But what a lot of people said was this was so focused on Amir, it's almost as if we've given this person, you know, a podium to spout views which are not fringe views. They are views which are popular even until today. They're not marginal. And so the idea that we would be so drawn into this character, to his personality, to grow empathy for him, to be able to relate to him, for us almost never to leave him for the entire picture, it's a bit dangerous. That's what some of the, and now one could argue to the other side that in fact we need to break through this. We actually need to see in him all these other factors that we've been talking about that bring him to this moment in order to understand it and then perhaps work through it. And we could be talking about him as an individual or at a societal level, you know, bigger picture. But I don't know. I think it's a fascinating question, you know, for film. I wonder if anyone else has experience telling stories in this way, you know, how to have a feeling about that, or I don't know, would want to weigh in.
It just makes me think of, I remember maybe it was a year ago, a little more, I started seeing think pieces about think pieces. The think pieces that were being criticized were the ones that would run in like the New York Times, and it would be like basically giving a platform to someone who may have not quite been a white supremacist, but was like in that realm. And I don't want to just single out the New York Times. The point was there were mainstream news organizations and outlets that were trying to convey some understanding of what the increasingly radicalizing segment of society was thinking and feeling. And some people started saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be giving them so much platform.
Yeah, I'm on two sides of the, I don't know, because humanization, I think, is important, but like, I think that it's important for us to understand one another, but I do think that there's dangers. And, you know, as someone with a background as a journalist, Neil, I think I remember some of the same things, and Spokesman, of course, reported on the white supremacists that are in our backyard. And it was a conversation of how much should we be covering these folks. People, it could be argued, didn't really know about them until we reported them. And then all of a sudden, it normalizes them. But then also, how do you not call it out? Like if something happens and someone is victimized, how do you can't be silent on that either. But storytelling is important. I don't know.
I remember so vividly when this, and we were shocked when we learned that it was a Jew that did the killing. And I just didn't understand how that could happen. And after this movie came out, and then I certainly started studying it a little bit more. But when this movie first came out, a friend from Israel called me and said, Julie, I remember that you wanted to really understand how this could happen. Get this film and see it. And I think there's many things that I don't like, but I think it does show how something like that could happen. And there are lots of wonderful things about the religious in Israel, and there's down things about the religious in Israel. And I thought it really showed how the rabbis may have encouraged this, but then did not continue to afterwards. So there was such dilemma there on should they have spoken up that this was taking something to the extreme, but it is in the writings or not. I don't know, but to me it was a really thinking piece that showed how this could happen.
I thought it was interesting in the prior to the credits at the end, where they reviewed the fates of Amir and the other folks who were determined to be involved, that they were very specific about saying that no religious leader, no rabbi was held accountable. And of course, we see that, as you alluded to, Rob, a few minutes ago, we see that exact situation in terms of our own country over the past 2 months, and it's very common that the incitement of violence grows out of highly respected, all be them radicalized religious leaders on the far right, on the far left, and across religions and cultures. And yet the folks who are at the root, or many of the folks who are at the root of the incitement are never held accountable in any way. I'm not talking only prison terms, but they are never held accountable by the public. They're not held accountable by the press. They're not held accountable by more moderate religious leaders. And I think that was, I was not, as Julie, I was not familiar with the role of the rabbis and the interpretation that they held forth of the right to murder, the justifiable right to murder, the pursued or the pursuer.
I was really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. You're probably on track.
I was just, I wondered how people felt the scenes toward the very end where they were in, I think what's now Ravine Square, right? And they were splicing in actual footage of that rally with, the dramatization of Yigal Amir before he assassinated Ravine. I mean, it gave me the chills, because I don't know how, I think Julie, you were mentioning, I remember I was a freshman in college with a group of students. We were from Boston, but we happened to be on a trip to New York. And the university I went to was a quarter Jewish. And we were on the bus. We had just gotten to New York City, and the news broke that Ravine had been assassinated. And I mean, people were crying. It was really, really emotional. And then I remember seeing, years later, I think a Frontline, the footage from the square, and watching it in this dramatization. And then also sort of, some of the lead up, with Netanyahu's rally, right? And then living through January 6th here in the United States, and Like, Neil, I know this was long, you picked this movie long before January 6th happened, but that also just gave me these chills because I know, like, Rabine's widow, right? I mean, she held Netanyahu personally responsible for a lot of this incitement to this day, you know, and if you ever watched her interviews, like, it's really, you know, and it's like, you kind of put this away, right? It's hard to believe when it was 25 years, but like going back and watching her and watching some of the footage of Netanyahu's rally and just like those posters and those effigies, like, you know, I mean, they kind of put to shame some of the stuff we saw on January 6th. They were just brutal of Rabin. And to think like, and watching the, you know, the crowd get hyped up and there be kind of silence, right? Like he didn't endorse it, but he didn't say, you know, oh my goodness, like this is terrible. How could you do this? This man's a, you know, a hero. And I don't know, it just brought back, it was weird kind of feeling the entire timeline, but it was particularly that scene at the end where they interspliced real footage with dramatization that really got to me. And I wondered if anyone else kind of found that powerful.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody, Rob, you talked about no society remains static, that they change, and we do have this ability to go toward peace and coexistence. But did anybody read the article in the New York Times Magazine on Sunday about the boiling over of attention, the pushing it back against masks and gatherings by the Haredi community? And in that article, it talked about that seems to be that eventually, I mean, if the reproductive rate continues, that would be Israel's future. And so is it possible that if they don't remain static, that it might merge toward the other, toward, you know, toward not peace, toward not coexistence?
So the little anthropologist in me likes to kind of look at that and say, I mean, it is possible. I mean, regression is always a thing, but that also, if you're regressing, then you're not static. But to that point though of, can you just get yourself to a point where you're like, no peace with anybody, you know, all war all the time? I mean, just to kind of take it out to the extreme, right? That's what we would call a maladaptive trait. That's our little anthropology speak of saying that is something that is going to destroy your society and you will no longer exist, right? So the classic example, like when we're teaching this to students, is you can have segments of your society that practice celibacy. If your entire society practices universal celibacy, you don't exist, right? That is a classic maladaptive trait. So, I mean, from that sort of lens, you can look at it and say, you know, if you want to go down these roads that sort of lead to these very rigid points in which it's all conflict all the time, you're not likely to survive as a society. It doesn't mean that there won't be individuals that don't survive out of it, but as a society, that's very difficult to maintain.
So does that mean Texas won't be around next year?
It takes time, Meryl.
I just wanted to clarify just for a second, Susan. It's a really interesting question and observation, and I actually think I just want to make sure that we're not. I think there is some connection between the phenomena of religious Zionist radicalism that we see in this film with Yigal Amir, and Haredi ultra-Orthodox insularity, which has manifested in recent months in a kind of rejectionist, anti-science attitude towards COVID and mask wearing and things like that. But in Israel, and for the most part here in the United States as well, but in Israel, those two communities often have shared interests, but they're not the same. And the Haredi communities that we see, which do, as you correctly mentioned, have a higher birth rate and present a demographic I want to say this in a way which is a demographic reality, a demographic challenge for Israel, but their politics are actually different. And the religious Zionist, more modern looking and acting communities are really driving the kind of politics that we hear from Netanyahu, the politics that we see from Yigal Amir. And those other communities may be the beneficiaries of that sometimes and their success, but their politics vis-a-vis the Arabs and vis-a-vis the Palestinians may not really align, and oftentimes don't. It's a real nuance in the picture, and I feel like it's just worth mentioning for their sake. My wife just said that community doesn't necessarily, many of that community doesn't even serve in the Israeli army, as a matter of fact, as a rejection of that. So whereas Yigal Amir and that particular side is passionate about serving the army, and people from that community are actually growing in a proportion of high-ranking officers, commanders, and people with massive influence in the level of the Israeli government and in the Israeli army itself.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that point.
And I wanted to tell you that going to Ravine Square is very emotional, and they've left some of the posters and things that were up, and so that anybody visiting Ravine Square can see them and know what happened. And it's certainly become more and more marked. Every time I've gone back to Israel, they've done more there to kind of show you what happens. And there also is a Ravine Museum in Tel Aviv that is absolutely fabulous, where you can go and you can see his entire life, but also at the end, I mean, it shows speech after speech where Netanyahu didn't help when you look back on it now, and was very against this peace process because he wasn't the prime minister at the time. And so politics did play a part. I personally, in watching the film, felt so sympathetic for the father. And I think that he knew what was coming, and he saw that his son was out of control. He blamed the army, which, you know, I don't think you can blame the army. There are people who, they're certainly taught skills there, but some take it more to heart than others. But I thought when he was in the synagogue, doing the prayers, and he talked and was reliving it and talked about the mother would never have joy again, or the same kind of joy. And then he looks over at his son. I think he very much sort of was foreseeing what was going to happen, but he couldn't get to him. And I thought that was so tragic, that in lots of situations like that, sometimes parents see things and it's out of their control no matter what they try. And so I thought that was I was very sympathetic for the father.
I found toward the end, the final argument between Amir and his father to be the most wrenching moment in the movie. And the father says, I think, in confronting the possibility that Amir could do this, or that someone may do this, the father says it'll take generations to heal that wound. And how true. It just struck me as, he also says it would be the worst thing to happen since the destruction of the temple, which is quite a thing to say. But yeah, how true his words are.
I agreed that that was a nice moment, or a very wrenching moment. However, the movie does have sort of the advantage of the foresight of how things have unfolded since then. So that's kind of a neat little trick, because it does feel like this is an all-wise father, but it's just an all-wise director, right? But no, I was very drawn in by that speech. That's only in retrospect that I'm thinking that way, because I'm cynical.
Well, I want to take a moment to pause and say it's 10 o'clock here in the Pacific time zone, where Aaron is. I believe it is 1 o'clock. Yeah. So I just want to say, originally I had foreseen this as a discussion that would probably wrap up around 10, but I also don't want to end it prematurely if some folks would like to add any thoughts, because I've really enjoyed hearing what everyone's had to say. So maybe we give it a few more minutes if folks would like to add some comments and then wrap it up. Does that sound good to everyone? And Rob, if there's anything else that you want to mention now too, that would be fine, not to put you on the spot. Oh, I killed it, didn't I?
Neil, I'd like to say just one more really quick thing. I know I've spoken a lot. I was really taken with the film. I'm so glad that you selected this and to the film festival for including this. There was one scene which felt almost like an afterthought, and yet I feel like it's particularly for an American Jewish audience highly relevant. And it's the one where he's in the room with a bunch of other potential Jewish agency shlichim, delegation that's going to go to the United States potentially. And he's sort of trying out for that, and they run him out of the room. And here you have these liberal, Tel Aviv, secular, creative type sort of people who just kind of basically throw him out. And I think it's powerful because at least for me as a Jewish American, I'm accustomed and was accustomed until I spent much more time living in Israel-Palestine to meeting everyone else in that conversation besides him, besides Yigal. And this movie is critical, and particularly for an American Jewish audience, because I hate to say this, and again, I spent still the better part of the last 7 years or so living there. The vast majority of the country is not like those other people in the circle. God bless them. And it's really important that when we're facing what's going on there and the current reality, that we take into account the multitude of voices, even the ones that have a lot of volume right now, like those that are somewhere in the taking off from or somewhere approximate to where Yigal and some of those in that circle were. And I just think it's important for us to see it. So thank you for choosing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think maybe we should end things for tonight, but it meant a lot to me to see those of you who've joined us, and I really appreciate getting a chance to talk about these films. I think that they're much more meaningful and valuable if we can have conversations about them. So thank you all for participating, and thank you so much to Rob as well for joining us tonight. Really appreciate your insights and your expertise, Rob.
Well, thanks for having me, Neil. This was fun.
Very good.